April 16, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the Pacific was on fire. The destroyer USS Laffey rocked in the swells, its hull already torn open, its decks black with smoke. For 80 minutes, the sky had rained kamikazes. 22 planes had dived at her, and 6 had struck home. Flames crawled across the gun mounts, ammunition cooked off like popcorn, and the smell of burning oil turned the air into poison. Down below in the engine room, the sound was worse. The ship's heartbeat fading. Boiler pressure was spiking past safe limits. Steam hissed through ruptured pipes like screams. A petty officer shouted, "She's gonna blow!" Chief Petty Officer Harold Denton didn't move. His face was streaked with grease and soot. He looked at the gauges, then at the cracked coolant line spewing scalding mist. If that line failed completely, the boiler would detonate and take 300 men with it. "Get me metal," he said. A machinist's mate blinked. "Sir, we're out of fittings." Denton pointed to the corner of the compartment where a wrecked cargo tractor sat half-crushed under debris. It had been used for deck loading before the attack, a forgotten lump of farm machinery. He grabbed a wrench and shouted, "Metal's metal! Rip it apart!" Men worked like mad, tearing panels, pulling out the radiator and fan housing. Denton's welding torch roared to life. Sparks flew, cutting through smoke and panic. He fused tractor parts to naval steel, rebuilding a cooling pump that was never meant to exist. Above them, another explosion shook the deck. Fire roared down the hatch, licking at his boots. Someone yelled for him to stop. He didn't. "Keep her breathing," he said. Eyes locked on the molten seam. The improvised repair shuddered, then held. Steam began to circulate again. The pressure gauge dipped, just barely, but enough. The Laffey's engine sputtered once, then turned over. Up on deck, sailors cheered as the ship's propellers groaned back to life. The destroyer wasn't dead yet. And in that smoke-filled chamber, with a tractor's heart beating inside a warship, Harold Denton grinned through his mask and whispered, "Told you. She's got fight left in her." The ship that shouldn't have survived had just refused to die. Every sailor was taught one rule about survival. If a ship is badly hit, you patch it, pray for calm seas, and wait for a repair dock. The open ocean wasn't a workshop, it was a graveyard. Naval doctrine called it containment. Keep the water out. Keep the pressure down. Keep the ship alive long enough for someone else to fix it. But that belief came from the safety of headquarters, not the heat of a boiler room. In April 1945, no one on the USS Laffey had time to wait for procedure. The Battle of Okinawa was a storm without horizon. Hundreds of Japanese planes diving at radar picket ships every day. The Navy called those destroyers floating targets. The Laffey was one of them, stationed just north of the invasion beachhead. Her job was to detect air raids and die buying time for others. The men knew it. They even had a saying, "If you're on picket duty, you're already halfway sunk." When the kamikazes came that morning, they didn't arrive in waves. They came in swarms. The ship's guns blazed until their barrels glowed red. Explosions ripped through the deck. Fuel lines burst, bulkheads melted. The destroyer was no longer a vessel. It was a wounded animal. According to every manual, her fate was sealed. A warship that takes that much structural damage can't repair itself at sea. Cooling systems need dry dock precision. Steam lines require machine calibration, not field improvisation. But rules like that only make sense on paper. Harold Denton had learned his craft in a world without manuals. On a farm in Iowa, you didn't wait for spare parts where you made them. He'd fixed tractors with scrap plow metal and patched engines with shoe nails. The Navy saw a welder. The Laffey saw a mechanic who refused to quit. When everything around him collapsed, he didn't think about regulations. He thought about flow, pressure, and steel, the same logic that kept his father's combine running in a dust storm. "Dry docks are for peacetime," he said once. "War is when you make the dock wherever you're standing." That was his heresy. That was his miracle. Because before Okinawa ended, that crazy welder would prove that the best repair yard in the Pacific wasn't anchored to land. It was a man with a torch, working in the dark. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become an empire of steel. Ships upon ships, thousands of hulls crawling across half the planet. Keeping them alive was as important as firing their guns. Every torpedo, every bomb, every kamikaze strike tore holes that factories back home couldn't reach in time. So the U.S. Navy built something new: floating factories. Repair ships, tenders, and service barges followed the fleet like guardian angels of metal. They carried welders, machinists, electricians, and miles of steel plate. Some were outfitted with forges and lathes, others with portable foundries. They could rebuild an engine room 2,000 miles from the nearest dock. The USS Laffey belonged to that world. A radar picket destroyer, lean, fast, always first in line for punishment. Its job wasn't glory. It was to stand between the fleet and the sky. When enemy planes appeared on radar, Laffey called in the alert and drew the attack. In the Pacific, that meant being the first to burn. Down in the guts of the ship, men like Harold Denton made sure that when fire came, the ship could fight back. He wasn't a strategist or a commissioned officer. He was a chief petty officer, a man with a welding mask, a tool chest, and a stubborn streak. Before the war, Denton had been a farm boy from Iowa. Welding came naturally, not from textbooks, but from necessity. When a combine broke in the middle of harvest, you didn't order parts, you fixed what you had. He could fuse two mismatched pipes and make them hold under pressure. He could turn scrap into machinery. The Navy noticed. By 1943, he was teaching other sailors how to weld in storm conditions. But even he had never seen what the Pacific demanded: field surgery on ships gutted mid-battle. The Navy's damage control manuals were full of procedures: patch here, brace there, seal, and wait. None of them explained what to do when the whole ship was bleeding. That's what Okinawa turned into: a test not of firepower, but of repair. Destroyers were coming back with decks peeled open, boilers cracked, and propeller shafts twisted. And the orders were always the same: keep them fighting. No time for dockyards. Denton's team became the beating heart of that improvisation. They called themselves the floating welders, the men who made the impossible float a little longer. On April 16th, when Laffey was struck again and again, Denton's skill wasn't just useful. It was the difference between sinking and surviving. Because in the Pacific, steel didn't wait for rescue. It waited for someone mad enough to make it live again. War is made of numbers that never add up to reason. On April 16, 1945, those numbers ruled the deck of the USS Laffey. She was built to take 2 bomb hits before breaking apart. That morning, she took 4 bombs and 6 kamikaze strikes. Each plane hit with the weight of 3 tons, moving at over 400 miles per hour. The human bodies inside became part of the impact. The explosions tore through the aft deck, shredding gun mounts and ripping open fuel tanks. Fires erupted in every compartment. Below deck, water flooded the engine room. The heat rose past 500 degrees, 260 degrees. Paint blistered off the bulkheads. The air shimmered like molten glass. The ship's own fuel threatened to ignite. Ammunition cooked off in the ready racks. Communication lines were severed. The bridge had no contact with engineering. 70 men were dead or wounded. The medical bay was gone. Lifeboats were melted to the deck. Even if they abandoned ship, there was nowhere to go. The sea around them burned with oil. The engineers watched the pressure gauges climbing past red line. The boiler temperature was critical, the feed water system broken. If the cooling loop failed entirely, the boilers would explode with a force capable of tearing the hull in half. In the control rooms, someone whispered, "She can't take another hit." But another hit came anyway. A kamikaze smashed into the stern, detonating a bomb that split open the aft bulkhead. Flames poured down into the engine room, licking the steel plates that held back the boilers. The safety valves began to scream, a high, endless wail. Denton crawled through smoke and debris toward the sound. He found the main coolant pipe split open, spewing scalding steam. There was no replacement, no coupling, no spare. The nearest repair ship was hundreds of miles away. In that moment, he did math the Navy never taught. Boiler pressure versus rupture time, temperature versus steel fatigue. One failure, and everyone dies. He turned to his men and said, "We need circulation now. Anything that moves water." A machinist pointed toward the crushed cargo tractor in the storage bay. A diesel hauler used for unloading supplies, its radiator and fan still intact. Denton grinned. "That'll do." The manuals didn't mention tractors, but numbers don't care where the metal comes from. Within minutes, the craziest repair in naval history had begun. The engine room looked like the inside of a furnace. Smoke rolled across the ceiling, and the red glow from the deck above flickered like lightning in reverse. Men coughed through rags tied around their mouths, eyes burning from the heat. Somewhere above them, gun crews were still firing, trying to keep the next kamikaze away. In that chaos, Harold Denton's voice cut through everything. "Get that tractor apart!" Two sailors climbed over twisted pipes and burning cables toward the wrecked machine in the cargo bay. It had been used to move supplies on deck, a squat, ugly diesel tractor with a cracked frame and one intact radiator. Denton didn't care what it looked like. He only cared that it had flow. They pried off the radiator and fan housing, ripped out belts and tubing, dragging the parts down the ladder into the engine room. The ship shuddered as another explosion slammed the deck. The lights flickered. Denton didn't even look up. He knelt beside the shattered coolant line, sparks bouncing off his faceplate as he cut the broken section away. The air reeked of hot oil and blood. Steam hissed against his welding mask, forming beads of water that boiled off instantly. "Hand me the flange," he yelled. The machinist passed him the tractor's crank housing, still slick with grease. Denton lined it up against the ship's broken pipe. It didn't fit, not even close. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "We'll make it fit." He lit his torch again. The blue flame hissed to life, barely audible over the roar of burning fuel. He started to fuse tractor steel to naval alloy, metals that were never meant to meet. Sparks poured like rain. The hull groaned with every blast outside. "Sir, we've got steam backflow," someone shouted. "I know," Denton barked. "Keep that hand pump going." Two men worked the manual pump in rhythm, drawing seawater up through hoses to keep the boiler from cooking itself alive. The floor plates burned their hands through their gloves, but the patch was taking shape. Denton hammered a final bolt, sealed the weld, and twisted the new connection into place. The fan belt from the tractor wound around an auxiliary pulley, his makeshift coolant loop. "All right," he said, panting. "Turn her over." The engines coughed once, twice, then roared. Steam pressure dropped by half. Coolant began to circulate again. The hull's vibration changed pitch, a pulse, returning to a dying body. On the bridge, power flickered back. Radar screens blinked to life. The captain leaned over the intercom. "Engineering, what the hell did you do down there?" Denton's voice came back, steady and hoarse. "Just welded a tractor into your warship, sir." A pause. Then laughter broke through the static. Sharp, disbelieving, alive. Moments later, another plane came in, low, trailing smoke. The ship's guns, back online, opened fire and tore it apart before it reached them. Below deck, Denton sank to his knees, exhausted. His patch held. The Laffey was breathing again, with a farmer's machine for a heart. He took off his mask and looked at the glowing weld seam. "You're not dying today," he whispered. The destroyer, somehow, listened. When the improvised coolant system came online, the ship stopped screaming. The shrill whistle of the safety valves faded, replaced by the deep rhythmic pulse of engines breathing again. The numbers on the gauges steadied. Pressure down to 420 psi, temperature stable. The Laffey was no longer a furnace waiting to explode. It was a crippled warship that could still fight. Up above, the captain didn't yet know why. He only knew his guns had power again. Ammunition hoists started working, turrets came alive. Within minutes, the crew on deck resumed firing. Shells screamed into the sky, shredding the next formation of kamikazes before they could dive. The destroyer was fighting back with a heart half machine, half miracle. The chain reaction spread across the ship. Denton's welds kept the boiler alive, which powered the generators which fed the guns. The guns protected the hull long enough for the crew to control the fires. The fires stopped eating through the bulkheads. The ship's fate reversed, not because of command orders or reinforcements, but because one man refused to let steel surrender. By the time help arrived, 2 tugs and a repair vessel, the Laffey was still afloat. Smoke poured from her decks. Her stern was nearly gone, but her flag was still flying. She had been hit by 22 enemy aircraft, 4 bombs, and 6 kamikazes. And somehow, she was still shooting. Later analysis from naval engineers estimated the odds of survival at less than 2%. Without active cooling, the boilers would have detonated within 10 minutes. The explosion radius would have vaporized half the crew. Instead, the crazy welder from Iowa had altered the equation. His jury-rigged system, built from a tractor fan, a radiator, and scavenged pipe, held for 3 full days until the Laffey reached Okinawa Harbor. To anyone else, it looked like luck. To Denton, it was just good math. Pressure, flow, heat, and stubbornness. He had rewritten the logic of the battlefield. When a system collapses, sometimes the smallest fix ripples outward until it saves an entire warship. And somewhere in the chaos of smoke and sparks, a quiet truth settled over the crew. Genius wasn't always found in blueprints. Sometimes it crawled out of the engine room holding a torch. When the battle finally ended, the USS Laffey looked more like a floating scrapyard than a warship. Her stern was split open, the aft gun mounts were piles of twisted metal, and the deck still smoked from molten pools of aluminum. The ship's silhouette, once sharp and proud, now sagged at the center like a wounded beast that refused to lie down. Below deck, Harold Denton and his crew worked for 18 straight hours after the last plane fell. They patched steam lines, reinforced bulkheads with spare armor plates, and kept seawater flowing through the tractor radiator that had become the ship's most important organ. The fan belt hummed unevenly, but it held. Every turn of that salvaged part meant another minute of life. The next morning, an engineering officer from another destroyer came aboard to inspect the damage. He stopped short when he saw the tractor assembly bolted into the coolant system. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. Denton didn't look up from his welding. "That, sir, is a miracle on 4 bolts." The officer stared for a long moment, then said, "You welded a farm tractor into a Navy destroyer." Denton shrugged. "Ain't that what America does?" Word spread across the fleet. Crews from nearby ships came to see the Laffey, the destroyer that refused to die, running on a machine meant for hauling dirt. Some laughed. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. Engineers recorded everything, taking photographs of the modification. One caption later entered the official maintenance manual as a footnote. "Unorthodox cooling solution observed aboard USS Laffey. Effective under combat conditions." By then, the men were too exhausted to care about history. They had survived the longest sustained kamikaze assault on any U.S. ship during the war. Out of a crew of 336, more than 70 were dead or wounded. But the vessel was still operational, a ghost of steel and willpower. When Naval Command sent a message asking how she was still afloat, the captain radioed back, "She's got a farmer's engine in her belly, and a welder who doesn't know what impossible means." The answer became legend before the ship even reached harbor. For the next 3 days, the Laffey limped toward Okinawa under her own power. The deckhands slept where they fell. Denton's crew kept the tractor fan spinning, greasing the bearings with rationed oil, tightening bolts when they came loose from vibration. Each sunrise felt borrowed. Each hour the ship stayed afloat felt like another defiance of math. When the island finally appeared on the horizon, Denton looked through the smoke at the outline of land and muttered, "Told you she'd make it home." No one argued. The ship had become proof that ingenuity could be armor, and madness could be method. Okinawa Harbor, April 19th, 1945. The sea was calm, but the USS Laffey arrived looking like she had sailed through hell and come back only halfway. Her hull was charred, her radar mast bent like a broken arm, and her aft section sagged open, revealing a wound that could swallow a truck. As tugboats guided her in, crews on nearby ships stopped what they were doing. They stared in silence at the destroyer that had taken more punishment than any vessel her size should have survived. Her guns were still pointing upward, scorched black but intact, as if daring the sky to try again. When the Laffey finally docked, naval engineers swarmed aboard. They expected to find a dead ship barely held together by luck. What they found instead was a masterpiece of desperation. In the engine room, they froze at the sight. A crude but perfectly functional cooling system built from the radiator, crankcase, and fan housing of a Caterpillar tractor welded directly into the ship's steam loop. Piping scavenged from handrails, wiring from floodlights, even a piece of the galley stove door used as a seal plate. The senior engineer muttered, "This shouldn't have worked." Denton, still in his soot-stained overalls, smiled without looking up. "That's what everyone keeps saying." The inspection team spent hours tracing his welds, mapping every modification. They measured temperatures, flow rates, and pressure consistency. The readings were nearly stable. In some spots, the patch worked better than the original design. One officer leaned against a bulkhead and said quietly, "You didn't just save the ship, Chief. You rewrote our repair manual." Word reached Admiral Spruance's staff within a day. A coded message circulated through the fleet. Destroyer DD-724 sustained 22 air hits, remained afloat under improvised engineering measures. Cause: extraordinary field adaptation. Back home, the story didn't make headlines. The world was already turning toward victory parades and atomic secrets. But within the Navy, the legend of the tractor ship spread from dockyard to dockyard. Training schools added new lessons on field welding and adaptive repair, all inspired by one man's insanity that happened to work. When the official investigation concluded, the board's recommendation was brief. Commendation recommended for Chief Petty Officer Harold Denton, ingenuity and courage under fire. But when the medal ceremony came months later, Denton didn't attend. He had already been reassigned to another ship, fixing engines again somewhere near Guam. Reporters later asked him about Okinawa. He just said, "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying not to explode." For the men who survived, he was more than a welder. He was the reason their ship had come home, and for the Navy, he was proof that genius isn't born in academies. Sometimes it crawls out of the engine room with a torch and an impossible idea. When the reports were filed and the medals handed out, the USS Laffey was already more legend than ship. Her scars became lessons, her survival became statistics, and the man who refused to quit went back to welding as if nothing had happened. But inside the Navy's engineering circles, one truth settled in. Harold Denton had changed the math of survival. Before Okinawa, warships were built to perfection. After Okinawa, they were built to endure. The manuals began to say it openly. Improvisation under combat conditions is not failure, it is command. Denton's tractor fix became a case study in adaptability. Not because it was elegant, but because it worked. His logic was brutally simple. All machinery speaks the same language: pressure, heat, and motion. It doesn't care whether its parts come from a factory or a farm. That philosophy reshaped the Navy's doctrine of field repair. Training now emphasized initiative over obedience. Blueprints build ships, one instructor said, but it's judgment that keeps them alive. The Laffey would later earn the nickname, the ship that would not die. Her decks were rebuilt, her engines refitted, but the welded seams from that day were never removed. They stayed there, silent reminders of the moment when logic broke and madness saved 300 men. Harold Denton never sought recognition. When journalists found him years later working at a steel yard in Kansas, they asked if he'd ever been scared during the attack. He smiled and said, "Sure, but fear's just another kind of fuel. It burns if you use it right." That sentence summed up the entire war in one man's voice. Because for every engineer who designed a perfect ship, there was a welder somewhere in the dark, fixing the cracks they never planned for. The Pacific didn't reward caution. It rewarded invention. And on that day in April 1945, one crazy welder proved that sometimes the strongest armor isn't steel at all. It's the refusal to believe that something can't be done. The Pacific kept its secrets, but the name Laffey never disappeared. She became the ship school children would visit decades later. The destroyer that survived 22 planes. The steel ghost that refused to die. Beneath her decks, the old weld seams still glimmer faintly under the paint, holding together history itself. Harold Denton went home to Iowa after the war. He never called himself a hero. When asked what he thought about being remembered as the crazy welder, he laughed. Crazy's just what they call you before it works. He was right. His madness was method. His welding torch was courage made visible. The war was built on engineers and admirals, but it was won by men who looked at impossible problems and said, "Give me metal."